Hi, this is Dave of JavaCodeJunkie.com and welcome back to another tutorial on MariaDB. In this video, we will learn how to create tables using the MariaDB relational database. I'm going to cover the following topics: how to create a table, which will also include how to create column definitions and how to create index definitions. So let's get started. So let's open up a command window, CMD. And then let's open up the MariaDB monitor. And enter our password. And we're going to use the tutorial database that we created in a previous episode. And to do that, we say use tutorial, which is the name of the database. And the name of the database is reflected in the left-hand margin. Let's look at the basic syntax of the create table statement. And I'm going to do this in the MariaDB monitor, and in a little while I'll show you also how to do that in HeidiSQL, which is the database admin tool that comes with MariaDB. So the create table statement starts off with create table. And then we need to specify a name for the table. So for the example, I'm going to use a table called employees. And then we have an open round bracket. And we can do this in the MariaDB monitor on multiple lines, and nothing will be sent to the database server until we enter our trailing semicolon, which is for the end of line or end of command. So let's hit enter. And now let's describe the first column of the table. I'm going to have a column called ID, and then we specify the data type for it. In this case, it's going to be integer, and it's going to be the primary key, so we say primary key. And I'm also going to have MariaDB provide the value for this column by using the auto increment keyword. And what that does is whenever a record is added to this table, MariaDB provides an auto incrementing integer that goes from 1 up until the highest number of records that you've added to the database. So that's it for the first column. The next column, I'm going to have an employee ID. Again, it's integer. I'm going to specify explicitly in this case that it is not to be a null value. In other words, a value is required for employee ID for each record that's entered into the employees table. And also I'm going to specify that the value that's entered for employee ID has to be unique for each record. And to do that, we specify unique key. You could also specify simply just unique. You don't really need the key. And then I'm going to have a first name. Now this one is not going to be an integer. It's going to be a varchar, so a variable number of characters. I'm going to allow 30 for that. Again, first name is required, so it cannot be null, so we specify the not null. And then for last name, same, varchar 30, not null. And finally, a birth date. And that is of type date. And now we specify the closing round bracket and our end of command delimiter, which is the semicolon. When we hit the enter key, the command will be sent to the database server, and if everything's been entered correctly, the table will be created. And now we can show the layout of the table by using the describe keyword. So we would say describe employees, semicolon, and enter. And there's the layout of the table exactly as we entered it. So let's quickly go over what we've done in the setup of this table. We've created 5 fields in the employee table. They are ID, employee ID, first name, last name, and birth date. Each of these columns has a data type. The data type for ID and employee ID are both integer. For first name and last name, they are a variable number of characters, 30 maximum, so they're varchar 30. And the birth date is a date column. The first 4 columns must have a value, and then we specified that with our not null constraint on the columns. The last column, the date of birth, can be null. We've set up a primary key, and this has to be unique, and if no value is provided when a record is entered into the table, a value is provided. A value will be provided by MariaDB by using the auto increment feature. The employee ID has to be unique so that each record has a different value. Well, let's take a look at how that looks in Heidi SQL. We're going to log into the local database server, and we now have an employees table. We double click on that. We'll see that we have all of the fields that we entered along with their specifications. So the ID is an integer. It is an auto increment. The employee ID is an integer. The first name, last name are varchar with a maximum size of 30, and the birth date is a date type, and it can be null. If we look at the indexes, we have 2, one being the primary key, which is the ID column, and the second one being the employee ID, which is a unique index. We also can look at the code that's necessary to create that table, and we'll see that it is formatted and shown a little differently than what we entered into the MariaDB monitor, in that all of the fields have been quoted. We see that the collation sequence for the last name and first name has been specified, and this is based on the collation sequence that we set up for the database, since we didn't specify one specifically for each of these columns. And we'll see that the primary key and unique indexes that we specified on the first 2 fields, the ID and the employee ID, have actually been moved to a separate line. And the primary key specified by the ID column using B-tree storage, as well as the unique index specified with the employee ID column. The unique index for the employee ID column, which has been given a name employee ID, also using B-tree storage. And the collation sequence for the table has also been specified based on the default that we set up for the database, again, since we didn't specify one for the table. And the engine type is InnoDB, which is the default for MariaDB. In this video tutorial, we had an introductory look at how to create tables using MariaDB. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please like and subscribe and click the bell icon to get new video updates. Thanks for hanging out with me again today. I hope to see you again in the next video. Until then, stay safe and keep on coding.